Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. And today we're going to Latin America, but looks like a whole bunch of different places. We're going to at least talk to people who have some knowledge of Latin America. Marianne Larson taught in a high school, I think in El Paso. So I'm assuming that has sustained itself as an interest in Latin American society and maybe Mexico. Aaron Tovish has just returned from another trip around Mexico, where he goes to have a holiday now and then. He lives with his wife, who is the Swedish ambassador to Mexico, in what he tells me is not in the embassy, but in the residence that goes with the embassy. And he is a former peace activist organizer who ran Rayers for Peace and something called 2020 Vision for a long, long time, among other great deeds. I first knew him when he was running something called Parliamentarians Global Action at the United Nations. Doug Saunders is the Globe and Mail International Affairs man who has traveled the world widely, and I'm sure will be interested in Latin America too, if I'm not mistaken. And Maria Puerta is in Orlando, Florida. She is a Venezuelan, an expatriate to the United States, and a political scientist who's been teaching, teaches in various universities, including one in Puerto Rico. And I've talked to her before about the voting patterns of Venezuelans in the United States. A lot of them were very favorable toward Trump, which amazed me, but I guess she set me right about why that was the case. So, welcome, folks. And we never have an agenda, but I did sort of anticipate that you folks have something in common, that is an interest in Latin America. Now, Doug was about to ask a question, and I interrupted him. Go ahead, Doug. What is it you want to know?
Thank you, Meta. Look, I can't resist the opportunity, since we have somebody who's in Mexico and knows it, and we have a member of the Venezuelan diaspora in the United States. There's a lot I'm thinking this week about what often gets called the Mexican-U.S. border crisis, and looking at the data behind it, I can't help thinking that it's not actually a crisis of the United States or of Mexico particularly, but a crisis of emigration involving a number of Latin American countries right at the moment, including Guatemala and Salvador, and also Venezuela, and also some other places that have experienced recently an almost perfect storm of pandemic situations, political stability crises, weather events, and other natural disasters, and economic situations. And I'm wondering if there's a way that countries like Canada, for example, can shift this from being something that is causing people to have to travel across Mexico in irregular movements into something that could allow the needs for people to move to be addressed regionally and also internationally through countries like Canada that have a demand for people. That's the broad question that is on my mind this week, but I certainly would be interested in hearing anything observationally about this whole regional phenomenon and the way it's been characterized as being a U.S.-Mexican problem.
I think this is a structural problem the U.S. has had for a while. It was before with Mexicans, but Mexicans are not on the top of the list of the people who are coming into the country through the southern border. We have Central Americans, mostly Guatemalans, Salvadorians, Hondurans, and Venezuelans are also making their way through the southern border. So it's not just a migration problem. It's, as you said, that this is an economic crisis that has been fueled by years of flawed political regimes but also by decisions made, unfortunately, with the last administration with Trump, when he resigned, he decided to end a program that was making sure that people in Central America and the Northern Triangle would have some opportunities to fight. For example, um, they were having problems due to climate change. Their crops were being lost either because of drought or because of flooding. But in any case, they were experiencing the consequences of climate change. So Obama started a program to help them out. But Trump decided that he wasn't going to waste money on those countries. You know how he used to call them. So that was part of the problem. But then this crisis is a consequence of the accumulation of all those very bad decisions that were made. And now what we have at the border is, because of the pandemic, the number of migrants waiting to make their way through the port of entry to claim asylum. Well, it's among the highest, but it's also a seasonal issue. These are not numbers very different from all the previous, fiscal years, 2020, 2019. So right now the opposition is making a big deal of it, but last year and the year before, they were, treating it as just, people trying to assault the country. So I guess, as you said, this is a matter of framing, and sometimes media doesn't really help a lot.
Doug, I think you were asking in a way, could we in Canada take some of those people? Is that what you were driving at?
Most refugees are not natural refugees. Most people who appear as refugees are moving because they have to get out of the country, but they're also seeking a stable place to live and to be part of the economy. Yeah. Most economic immigrants, like regular immigrants in a country like Canada, are also fleeing a situation politically and economically that they can't bear. So the two things that strike me is that a lot more can be done to create regular pathways for people within the region, in neighboring countries. I mean, I know Colombia's done a lot to receive Venezuelans, and it's a political mess in Colombia at the moment. But also in wealthier countries that need people, to recognize that this is to the advantage. Canada has history since the Second World War, has been benefiting from essentially the flight of the middle classes of various countries facing political crises becoming part of it. So a mixture of diplomatic work to create normalized routes within the region, and also efforts to both receive people as asylum seekers and also as regular immigrants, which many of them would prefer to be, would be part of it, I would imagine. And this would help. I think we would have a lot of buy-in from Mexico, which isn't very happy being a transit country at the moment. Mexico had a horrible time during COVID because you had both a situation where tens of thousands of Mexicans were effectively expelled from the United States during the pandemic. And you had a massing of people at the northern border of Mexico who were seeking passage northward. So you had a really dangerous situation where tens of thousands of people were being expelled southward from the United States. Tens of thousands were massed at the border hoping to move northward. And then you had a whole lot of people who gave up in either direction and were moving into cities inside Mexico, and creating problems of populations who were too close together and lacking homes to stay in within Mexico, from both coming up from the south and down from the north, and being an infectious risk within Mexico. And any situation that causes Mexico to have to be a transit country means that something's failed, and that better off countries can be doing things to help this.
I live in London, Ontario, and that's in southwestern Ontario. For those of you who aren't Canadian or based in Canada, there's so much of a problem right now with not being able to get farm workers and typically they've come from Mexico and other Central American countries, and they've worked on Canadian farms, picking crops and doing other various things. And the farmers are just desperate right now. Like, they will lose entire crops, a whole season's worth, if they cannot get people coming. And they're having a terrible time, particularly the farmers around a town called Leamington. And Leamington produces like so many of our crops that are consumed throughout Ontario, if not further away. And to me, it's crazy to think that here is a problem that we have that could be relatively easily addressed by bringing in farm workers for a period of time. And many of them are, sending the money back to their families, and they come for, a season, and then they go back home to their families, wherever those families are. So I just wanted to put that out there. The other thing that this conversation is making me think about, and it's interesting that Meta pulled out my one little, I guess, Latin American connection. I mean, in addition to living in El Paso for a year, I have traveled quite a bit in Latin America. But my year living and teaching right on the border, El Paso, Texas borders the Mexican city of Juarez. And one of the many things that I learned while I was living down there, and it was an incredibly difficult year for me as a teacher, but also a year where I learned so much. When you live on the border, you realize that borders are really fluid. Like, people who live on borders have a completely different idea about what a border means. And I don't think politicians who make many of the policies about border crossings have ever lived on a border. Like in El Paso, it's a completely fluid relationship, as much as it possibly can be. And of course, that relationship was tried under the Trump administration. But people go back and forth across the border all the time. I taught students in El Paso who lived in Juarez, whose parents lived in Juarez, whose grandparents did, who went back and forth every day. I walked back and forth on the border. I walked into Juarez frequently. So to me, it's really fascinating to think about how we think about borders and what borders mean, and why in times of crisis people want to strengthen borders and really have a very, to be, narrow understanding about borders. So I'll just put that out there as a couple of thoughts, but thanks for raising this topic.
One of the questions that occurs to me is, I gather that the reason the farm workers can't come in is because of regular, very rigid rules about crossing the U.S.-Canada border. I don't know, but if that's the case, farm work is out of doors, and they say that being out of doors is a whole lot easier than being indoors for COVID. And
but Meta, they live in dormitories, like 8 people to a room.
Oh, do they have to?
No.
I mean, if they set up, if they couldn't they rent trailers or something and let them live in smaller units?
There are farmers that have addressed this problem of the dormitories and provided safer housing and accommodation for their farm workers. I mean, they need to, because they're desperate to get the farm workers here. So they need to address those very real problems. And there's been outbreaks in some of the dormitories. And as a result, there's been some changes. And I can't speak on behalf of all farmers, but I know that many are desperate to get farm workers and will do what they need to do to keep those farm workers safe.
Where's the bottleneck? Is the bottleneck at the Mexican border or at the Canadian border?
It's the Canadian government, I think, that's made it really difficult. And certainly in terms of visas, I've read about the difficulty in getting a visa from Canada to be able to travel.
It's very difficult, even for people who are not necessarily temporary or seasonal workers. For example, I was, weighing if it would be better for me, Canada or the US. With all the difficulties here, it was easier for me here. So yes, it's a little bit more strict. But I wanted to add something to those farm workers. Right now in the US, we're having problems with them because some are undocumented, but some of them are legally working here. And those visas suffered a steep cut from the Trump administration. So we would be facing shortages if it weren't for the undocumented workers. The other problem is that they can't spend that much on housing because they're trying to send remittances to their country. So that it wouldn't make sense for them to. Housing here is very expensive, so it wouldn't make sense for them to spend a lot here and living. What are they going to send back home? So it's kind of a. The other thing is that I've been looking at the problem that we're facing in the U.S. with a slow population growth. We've been experimenting since 2017. I've been writing that because my is that if the stagnation here in terms of population, our economy here is going to suffer a lot. And right now, some businesses are demanding workers, and I'm not talking about farm workers. I started here as an English teacher. That was my first job here in 2016 because they couldn't find teachers, American teachers. So that gives you an idea of how bad it is and how little attention politicians are paying to this. We need immigrants. This is a huge country with a huge economy that its population is not enough for consumption in terms of consumption. And with the shutdown of the immigration system here, we have probably created a crisis that's going to start hitting us very soon.
I'm kind of surprised that the Canadian government isn't more receptive to the plight of the Canadian farmers. I would think they were a rather important constituency.
I found I was living in Germany for the first half of the pandemic, and it was interesting that the German government placed a real priority, even though it did close some of its borders, at least its borders to the east, not to the west, to business travel. It placed a priority on getting the migrant laborers in from Romania and Turkey to to particularly harvest the asparagus crop, but other, which is almost a sacred thing in Germany. But also other crops. Now there were problems. So there's two ways to view this as a humanitarian issue. One of which is the labor rights and mobility rights of the agricultural workers coming in and out, and the importance of the remittances they send back. I mean, there are Central American countries whose largest source of foreign income is money sent back by family members working in countries to the north. Like, it exceeds all foreign aid plus all other parts of the economy combined. And on the other hand, there is also a humanitarian issue involving exploitation of migrant workers in countries like Canada and the United States, and exposing them to disease is one of those issues. We saw a lot of issues with outbreaks in agricultural communities, just as there have been in meatpacking plants and places like that. So the question for governments would be, are you exploiting people by not allowing them to come into the country, or are you exposing them to exploitation by requiring them to come into the country? And I don't know where the policy balance is. I have a sense of what should be the right thing to do, which is both to allow their visas and allow them to come in, and to strictly regulate standards of living conditions and so on. But on a day-to-day policy basis, I could see how this was a challenge for governments.
Well, I could see how the meatpacking plant is it would seem to be a harder problem because that has to be done indoors. And I imagine there's no easy way to make it a very sanitary situation or socially distant operation. But, you know, you could put tents out there if need be and give people enough air in their living.
You have to get them into the country, which involves air travel and airports and all that. And then on a day-to-day basis, even if they're not in a dormitory, they're all getting on a tiny little bus and being brought out to the fields and all that stuff. I mean, I think your instincts are right, Meta, that this is something that should be relatively trivial to get over, particularly since the loss of a season's harvest is a serious thing for farmers, and a lot of these are small farms. A small farm in Canada is one that employs fewer than 200 people, and but
What about all those school buses that aren't being used to take kids to school? Couldn't they be requisitioned and used for moving agricultural workers in less crowded circumstances?
that's pretty crowded circumstances. That's basically what they have. The reason why school buses are shut down is because they're pretty infectious.
Well, I mean, if you limit the number of people on each school bus, you should be able to do it safely.
Yeah, you should
Oh, yeah.
masks on them while they're on the bus.
Yeah.
It should be, I don't know.
Well, also now at this point, an interesting question is why shouldn't we give priority to vaccinating agricultural workers? And that's a whole set of policy things that are tricky too. Attempts to give priority to vaccination by importance of work. I mean, some was done to give frontline medical workers first shot, but attempts to do it by priority of work have kind of faltered because they've caused the general rate of vaccination to slow.
Okay, but how long does it take after you're vaccinated? I don't think there's a good answer to that. How long is it after vaccination before you're really safe to do almost anything you want to do? I've never heard a good answer to that.
I got my second vaccination yesterday, and I was told that I should continue to use the usual care for another 10 days.
I had my
Right.
first
So-
one yesterday.
What?
I had my first vaccination yesterday, so we're pretty slow here in Ontario, but
Mhm.
I was told the same thing, and then I have to wait till the second one as well.
Yeah, well then, suppose, Doug, everybody got vaccinated as they went to work, they'd still be in trouble unless they had the second one at least, and then some. So that
Well,
doesn't solve it.
This circles back to my initial point, which is that a lot of the things that we regard as problems involving migrants in countries in the north are things that wouldn't be problems if we dealt with them in the sending countries, right? If our embassies and consulates and missions in the countries that produce agricultural migrant workers in Mexico and Central America were to say set up a program to pre-vaccinate people who wanted to come, right? And this is not an unusual way of thinking about things, just not in this particular context. I mean, Canada's 5 big banks devote more of their energies nowadays to signing up people in Pakistan and Iran and Philippines for bank accounts 10 years before they emigrate to Canada.
Really?
They know that those people are going to have a mortgage within 10 years after moving to Canada. So getting them signed up for a bank account means they're going to be loyal to that bank. So if we can do it for banking in the private sector, you think we could do it for vaccination, for solving flight migration problems and so on in the sending countries. I think there needs to be a reorientation of what we see as being migration crises.
Well, the only time I've given any thought
after people arrive to being crises we deal with before they leave,
The only time I've given any thought to the idea of trying to do a massive immigration to Canada from Mexico or from Latin American population was when Trump was making a very horrible situation, I think, with children and everything on the border. And I thought, my goodness, we could just swoop them up, bring them into Canada, make a big publicity campaign about how virtuous Canada is, accepting these miserable people and how contemptible the U.S. administration is. I was thinking of it more in terms of, kind of looking down on the U.S. administration rather than solving a Canadian problem of agriculture or food production.
So my father's Danish, and I spend my summers in Denmark, and well, I used to up until the pandemic, and so I have a lot of connection to through my Danish relatives and so on and so forth. And Denmark to me is probably one of the most xenophobic countries I've ever been to. I've never met more racists in my life as I have, blatant racists in Denmark.
Wow.
But Denmark is also a country that ranks very high in terms of the amount of foreign aid that they give. I think I've read that it's the fourth highest country in terms of spending on foreign aid and humanitarian work than other in the world, and it certainly exceeds the point. Doug and others might know this. Is it 0.7% that the UN is recommended in terms of for humanitarian aid?
Yes, it's 0.7% of your annual, your GDP.
Yeah.
They exceed that. Although keep in mind that the generous foreign aid and the xenophobic policies are not part of the same lump. They were not come up with by the same governments. It's the current weird coalition government that includes extreme right parties. I mean, for example, Denmark just voted to pass a law to send all of its Syrian refugees, even if they're settled for a decade, back to Syria.
Yes.
Which I was just in a sort of crisis webinar earlier this week with some European policy people, and trying to, the question was, how do we stop this? How do we at least get Turkey to take them halfway or something like that? Because
yeah, I guess my point is
not so cool, you know.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say my point is that from what I've been told, the assumption behind foreign humanitarian aid is to assist people in their countries of origin so they don't come to Denmark. In other words, help them in scare quotes with whatever humanitarian work needs to be done to prevent people from coming to Denmark, like keep Denmark free of the non-Danes. And so it's kind of perplexing to me, and problematic too, that you've got these two things in tension. And you're right, Doug, about the governments that have brought in the policies around humanitarian aid, but the current government is a progressive government that was brought in on an anti-immigrant platform. Like, they knew that they would only get elected with that platform. So
wow, you've just ruined my whole image of Scandinavia. I thought Scandinavians were just inherently born as angels. Did you say Swedes and Norwegians and Icelandics are also racist and bigots?
Well, let me say this, that the unity across the political spectrum for foreign aid is based on different principles at different parts of the spectrum. So you do have support for foreign aid, for example, from conservative religious groups who believe in charity, but who also believe in keeping their country very Christian. And therefore, they try to direct the aid in a way that will help to reduce immigration from non-Christian countries. On the left part of the spectrum, you have people who believe in solidarity and support foreign aid because people should have a good life where they live, and they shouldn't have to uproot themselves and move to a cold northern country like Sweden. So it's a unity of diverse opinions that all come behind keeping the foreign aid level fairly high. It's a match that could break down almost at any point, but so far it has produced this kind of strange consensus. You see the same thing in Norway, definitely. I'm sorry to hear that you're seeing this in Denmark as well. I can't speak for Iceland or Finland. I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't similar situations there. The foreign aid work they do is carried out by people, implemented by people who really do want to help these other countries. And to get back to a point, the original question from Doug, it's my understanding, and I don't know the details because I don't follow this issue closely, but it's my understanding that the Biden administration is looking at something that you could call a Marshall Plan for Central America, with the perspective of helping people make a life for themselves in these countries, despite all the afflictions they're facing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but Marianne, when you say that they're bigots or something, I don't remember your language, but do you mean that when they get there, if they do come in, they encounter discrimination or
Oh,
not?
yes. Oh, terrible. They immigrants, refugees to Denmark, those that are able to come, and there's very few, live in terrible housing conditions and housing complexes, and they're isolated. I could go on and on. There's big debates about, that people who think you shouldn't eat pork, there's something wrong with them. So there's like lots of debates and issues about that in schools and other workplaces. Yeah, it's
Where are of the people who do come? Where are they mostly from in Denmark?
Turkey. There's been a lot of actually since the 50s. There's been quite a few Turkish immigrants to Denmark, and some from the Middle East. But
also a lot of Portuguese and
Eastern Europeans,
Yugoslavs as well.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that Denmark's immigration policy is just a refugee policy. And this is true in Sweden largely as well, is that pretty much the only form of immigration that's recognized is asylum. And there's a weird reversal in Canada and the United States. Economic immigrants are seen as the good immigrants, and they're just looking for a job and a house, and refugees are somehow suspect and distrusted by the public. And it's exactly the opposite in Scandinavia. And I spent earlier this year, I was in Sweden a lot and in Denmark some, and the public view and the political view there is that economic immigrant is a scammer. It's somebody not to be trusted and to be discouraged, whereas asylum traditionally is seen as the valorous immigration. But the settlement policies are such that you can't get a job until you're fluent in the language, and you're basically dependent on state aid, and you're stuck in a public housing apartment that contains only other refugees, and you have nothing to do all day but hang around the shopping mall and smoke cigarettes, and that gives a bad public reputation to refugees. And of course, the North American idea is that first you integrate and then you learn the language. First you get a job and open your little shop or something like that, and maybe your kids will learn the language, but it's really not an issue. To say that in Scandinavia or Germany, to say, maybe we can let people integrate first and then learn the language, it's just a shock. All integration means in the political discourse there is learning the language, which is not an easy language to learn.
There was the intention from the Obama administration of maybe doing what the Danish government or the state has done, but without the xenophobic part. Obama thought that maybe a program that would deal with poverty and climate change in the Northern Triangle will help people because they really want to stay in their country. They don't want to come here and feel, rejected. But that was the intention. The spirit of that program was to help them with their crops, with their lives. But remember, there's another part of it, which is the gang culture in Salvador, which is really a problem. That, by the way, didn't start in El Salvador. It started here in the U.S. in Los Angeles. So it was an American problem that was exported when they deported those gang members. So this is, if you go way back to all those dictatorships that the U.S. Fostered and supported, we have, some history there that tells you have a moral duty. So what I did with these programs was try to level the field, not feeding the fears of conservatives with immigrants, because as Trump said, he wants, more like Danish or Swedish immigrants, but not these guys from down there. So that was part of the problem. But he absolutely gutted the program. So now what we're dealing with is the fact that they are here, they're at the border, and the other problem is that we don't have those programs that will give them handouts. So they will have to work during some time without papers, documents. And that is exactly what Republicans are arguing. They come here, they take our jobs, they earn less, and that's what employers want, to pay them half or 25% of the wages. So it creates a cycle where what we have here is not exactly or completely a xenophobic attitude, because not everyone. We have farmers here who want Mexican workers or Central American workers, and it's legitimate to say that it's not that all Americans are xenophobic or racist. It would be unfair, because that's not the case. But those who have a very loud voice, and those who go on Fox, for example, those are the ones who believe in, and replacement, for example, or this American First Caucus, that kind of thing. It has a market, it has an audience, but not everyone is aligned on that side.
I would say, in my impression, and Doug may or not, and Marianne may or may not agree, but my impression is that the Canadian population in general says we need immigrants, and it's a good thing to have immigrants, and we need more of them. In fact, this year, the immigration has dropped, and therefore there's a problem. They see we need to do something urgently to get up to the quota that we wanted. But that the general public opinion in the United States is that immigrants are people who are taking our jobs, and they're harmful for the economy and for everybody else. Am I wrongly characterizing it, or is there a real difference of public opinion?
If I can talk briefly about, because I do know something about this, about the problem with both that Obama plan and the Danish approach to foreign aid that we're discussing. And I think it is a worthy thing to say, we should deal with crisis migration, like with refugee flows and asylum, by stopping the problem at the country of origin. I mean, people do not generally want to have to flee, and it's much better to use aid and diplomacy to end the situation that causes people to emigrate, or alleviate it, or allow them to migrate regionally, which they'd prefer. However, there's a naive assumption, I think, in some government policies that you can end international immigration and asylum by improving the economic situations in countries. And it's based on the idea that people flee or emigrate because they're destitute and poor. And of course, the one group of people who do not emigrate out of countries are the very poor. In fact, countries don't start producing emigration except to immediately adjoining countries until they reach a fairly high level of economic status. Niger is probably the poorest country in the world, and it produces pretty much zero emigration internationally except to immediately adjoining countries. If you raised its standard of living to the level of, say, Morocco or Turkey, you'd have a lot of immigration out of there, because it's when people have a sense of hope and opportunity that they emigrate. The refugees who leave places like Syria, most go to camps in adjoining countries, in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. Those who actually apply for asylum internationally tend to be the educated middle class. It's a reason why so many of the Syrian refugees in Canada have opened successful businesses with 20 employees and things like this, because they were the university educated middle class of Syria, and certainly that fits the pattern of the Syrian refugees I've co-sponsored here, and same with immigration. So there's a bit of a paradox that saying we're going to end immigration by eliminating poverty. Well, by eliminating poverty, you're going to increase immigration, but the more desirable type. But certainly, as you're suggesting, trying to use aid and diplomatic tools to prevent horrid crisis migration is a worthy thing. I think we should set up our consulates and embassies and missions, as I said, in those countries toward helping people regionally and helping people realize their dreams and in a healthy way, rather than having to get on top of a train and go across 4 countries to some border that doesn't want them.
That's very interesting. I had never heard that argument before. Biden is attempting to revive some of Obama's economic aid efforts. And what you're suggesting is that that's not going to get the results that we might be hoping for. Hopefully,
only in terms of immigration reduction, which I don't know is a big.
Yeah. Hopefully, it would improve people's lives locally a bit, and that's of course a good thing. But I also thought it very interesting your suggestion that there should be a vaccination program in country, so that people are set and clear before they get on the plane or whatever means they use to get to the U.S. or Canada. But I will say this, that I got my 2 vaccinations not because of any effort by Sweden or the European Union to make sure that the diplomatic corps in foreign countries were safe. I got it from Carlos Slim and the Mexican government, who are actually doing a remarkably good job here. And so I think what you're asking for would require a real mindset change in the northern capitals, because right now, as we've seen, they're hoarding whatever vaccines they can get for their own population, even though a lot of their population doesn't even want to get vaccine. And there are desperate shortages elsewhere in the world.
You know, I heard one virologist, I can't remember where, say that the best thing the United States could do for itself and for its allies would be to mass vaccinate Brazil, because Brazil has the very, very worst COVID crisis of pretty much any country right now. And Brazil is so connected to every other South and Central American country across the Andes and across Central America through labor migration and so on, that it's mutating new varieties that might overwhelm vaccines and spreading them around the world, and that Americans won't be safe and other people in Western countries won't be safe until Brazil is vaccinated.
Right now.
I want to follow up on what you just said, Doug. One of the things I'm doing in my retirement is doing ESL mentoring online, obviously, with newcomers. And so the fellow that I usually talk with every Tuesday at this time is from Brazil. And we've been talking a lot about what's going on there. And he was telling me, much to my surprise, that they have a long history of these small neighborhood health collectives that are doing an excellent job at getting vaccines into the arms of Brazilians. And from his perspective, and of course, this is just one person, I get that, it just seemed to be a lot more organized and a lot more people were getting vaccinated a lot more quickly than here in Ontario. So that was quite a surprise to me. I didn't know that. I mean, I know you read in the news about the horrific number of cases of people with COVID in Brazil, but I didn't know that history of those small neighborhood health units has really been going a long way to help get that vaccine into people's arms.
But don't they have a shortage? I thought almost all the poorer countries, and maybe I don't know how Brazil ranks economically, but I thought that there was a huge disparity between the countries like the U.S. and even Canada having. From what I interviewed a guy from Science magazine who follows this closely, and he was saying that the U.S. and I believe Canada have ordered 500% as much vaccine as they need.
From what I understand, from what Marianne says, and I've certainly seen this in Brazil, they have very many states have very well organized community level health and welfare infrastructure. But of course, Brazil's problem is not from the bottom, it's from the top. right? I mean, they have a president who has appeared on TV saying vaccines are for sissies, and I'm never getting one. He actually caught COVID, and his chief aide died of COVID, but he still says vaccines are for sissies. And I don't know Brazilian Portuguese, but the word for was probably much ruder, and has not been interested in organizing an acquisition campaign to buy up vaccines at the level that other countries have, and so on. So some countries, there's problems on the ground and things are good at the top, and some countries, there's good things on the ground and problems at the top. You know.
I'm wondering if any of you have a good take on what's been happening in Nicaragua, because the mainstream media has essentially written off Nicaragua, but there are some reporters who are saying that the situation in Nicaragua is actually is quite good. Things are being handled quite well.
COVID, you mean, or what?
COVID.
I've been following the situation because I've been writing about COVID and democracy back sliding in Nicaragua. And what I've picked up from NGOs that work directly with health or that have some connection to healthcare workers is that there's opacity in the information. They're not allowed to disclose number of people with the virus, or there are some limits on to what media can report about disease. So there's a lot of restraint from those who are willing to speak. And there is concern, I guess, because there's this law against NGOs. So I think it's very difficult for them to inform. And government has been, from the beginning, they have been downplaying the virus in Nicaragua, but from information that we have had access to, and of course from other sources outside of Nicaragua, like from Costa Rica, for example. So there's some concern, not just because of COVID, but how they're handling, because there's no transparency in the information.
Marianne, what did you just enter in your chat?
Are the statistics in any way comparable to those in neighboring countries?
Well, we worked on a report that monitors in Latin America how governments have been handling COVID. And the problem with certain governments like Nicaragua, Venezuela, is that we can't fully have access to data because there's no way to have a complete set of numbers. For example, in Venezuela, what we do is that government has one set of data, but when we go to professional, healthcare workers and so on, the Academy of Sciences, they have a different set of data. And that's a problem because it creates, there are two kinds of, do you want the official number or do you want the non, official number? So that's a problem.
Aren't the non-official numbers in Nicaragua also rather low?
I don't know, because they are threatened. Those NGOs that have some way to, the last time I wrote about it, the people that had given the information to these NGOs that do the follow-up, they were being persecuted. So it's a risk for some people. It's a risk, even if they want to contribute to, making sure people are informed. I think they are taking a huge risk. So my impression is that people refrain from within healthcare workers. They refrain. I read a piece where this doctor who asked his name not to be disclosed, that he feared that the numbers were under recorded because they just don't want to admit that there is a crisis. I mean, Costa Rica and neighboring countries are having some casualties, are having high numbers. It is, you should understand it as part of a trend in the region. But I don't think we have firm data, or at least something you can trust.
The statistics are that 4.3% are fully vaccinated against COVID in Brazil, and 11.7% have had at least one dose. And I'm comparing that to Canada, where only 2.5% are fully vaccinated in Canada. And yes, we have more people, 25%, who have had at least one dose, myself included. But
Okay.
we're not. Canada is not near hasn't vaccinated fully as many people as they have in Brazil.
Mhm.
Again,
That's
I'm
right,
putting this
but
out there to be a bit of a devil's advocate, but also to suggest that there's a lot of room for improvement here in this so-called first world nation I call home.
I think another thing you need to take into account when you look at those figures is what's the age structure of the population. In Brazil, a huge percentage of the population is under 25, and a very much smaller percentage is over 60. So if you have 4% of the population fully vaccinated, that's probably more than 50% of the people over 60. And the same applies for a lot of developed countries. If they are in fact doing what the public health officials recommend, which is focusing at first on the older people, the percentage numbers are more significant where the number of older people is smaller. Now, that doesn't say anything about their overall health policies. Why don't people live longer? That's another issue.
There's sort of two facets to this, and that really hit federal countries hard, countries where the state and provincial governments have a lot of authority, because you have a division of powers between those who procure vaccines and the level of government that delivers them and causes them to be in people. And Canada and the EU countries, of course, are facing a problem. Canada and the EU countries are probably doing better vaccination campaigns than most countries are. Like Canada is getting, I think, close to 400,000 shots in arms per day at the moment, which is an impressive rate. I'm getting mine today, my first, thank you. But Canada didn't start really until April. And that's because its government, as you noted, it did its procurement earlier than most countries back in like March of 2020. And it smartly ordered from multiple sources. So, I mean, ordering 500 million doses for 38 million people is a good move, right? You want to over order. Doesn't mean you're going to use all those that you've ordered, but you want to be getting the first. But they ordered on the assumption that it would be over optimistic to expect vaccines to be ready by April of 2021. And so they ordered for April 2021 delivery, which they thought was optimistic. And the EU did similar on behalf of its 27 member countries. Britain, probably just because its civil service was good at this stuff, ordered for December delivery. And it ordered from the same German factories. So Britain was able to vaccinate most of its population using vaccines made in Germany, while Germans had to wait till April to get the vaccines made in Germany. So Europe and Canada are doing well as far as getting needles into people's arms, but had to wait a few months later. It's not very important in the end. I mean, India and Brazil have waited longer, but you're right. A lot of countries of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia actually have very good ground level health administrations for doing things like delivering vaccines and birth control and all these other things. And it's just a question of whether they're having to compete against much more resourced, wealthy nations as far as the procurement of these things.
Biden's vaccination diplomacy is going to be very important. If they really are committed to helping those nations with less access to the vaccine, this is their opportunity as part of a bloc, not just the U.S. They should make that part of the strategy to get herd immunity. But let's talk about those less favored countries. So that's important.
Mhm. Somebody said that the Mexican president got vaccinated today. Is that big news in Mexico, Aaron?
Confession, I don't follow Mexican news closely. Lately, I've been trying to follow what's happening in the Ukraine, which is a whole nother kettle of fish.
I think it'll be interesting whether or not we could take a vote right now. Hello, Kat. Hi, dear. He's looking right at me. I think it'd be a good question to have a little poll here. How many of us think that Russia's going to attack Ukraine?
I thought they were already doing so.
I think they're massing on the border, but are they really going to invade?
Well, take a look at this. I'm going to share the latest. A friend of mine who teaches at the U.S. Naval Academy, I asked him if this was a provocation or if this was for real. And he just answered, it is for real. I mean, those who know about it, they are taking this very seriously.
Now, wait, a news flash. Turkey just announced that the U.S. had decided not to send battleships into the Black Sea. I think the phone call between Biden and Putin has cooled things down considerably. There may be some civil war type activity between the Ukrainian government and the rebels in the east, but it's unlikely that there'll be international intervention at this point. And it's a great relief to hear, and let's hope it holds, because, well, there are enough flashpoints in the world without one like the Ukraine.
But we do have Russians in the Venezuelan border with Colombia.
What?
Yes, that's the other problem.
What? Russian troops?
Yeah.
Practically
Russian
every
what?
border in the world.
He sent some. He has sent some, not troops. He sent some, people that we understand are military, and supposedly to take care of some of the military equipment, arms, and stuff that Venezuela has bought. But the problem is that there's some presence at the border of irregulars from Colombia, and yesterday there was a buzz about them and the Russians there. So yeah.
I think the worry, in answer to your question, is that it'll be a situation where Russia does invade, but it tells everyone that it hasn't invaded, and does it in a sneaky enough way that it doesn't appear to be, so that there isn't any international support for Ukraine. And we're going to be left with this situation where Putin has done something to bolster his popularity by chiseling off another piece of Ukrainian territory.
Yes.
And nobody's going to do anything. We still haven't figured out how to get him out of Crimea. And
Exactly.
His use of strategic ambiguity on borders is his signature move.
Yeah. He's biting it. He's biting his way. Yeah. Well.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a whole new conversation that I need to organize. So you're all invited back. Hello, Kat. What is your cat's name again? Who's your cat?
This cat's named Sarah.
All right.
She has a twin sister.
I think I met one of them before. Okay, guys. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Nice.